Good evening. My name's Chris Bryan. Very happy to be here with you this evening and to talk about my book, Cedar Mountain to Antietam, a Civil War Campaign History of the Union 12th Corps. And tonight I'm going to be talking about the Cedar Mountain portion of that activity. Before the Maryland campaign, the 12th Corps was actually named the 2nd Corps Army of Virginia. And the Army of Virginia formed under Major General John Pope on June 26, 1862, right as the 7 Days battles were occurring on the York-James Peninsula, right down here. The Army of Virginia consisted of 3 corps that had operated independently and ineffectively in the Shenandoah Valley against Stonewall Jackson during May and early June of 1862. So the 1st Corps, Army of Virginia, was commanded by Franz Sigel. It was positioned, Pope had to go to Sperryville this year. And this force had previously been under John C. Fremont in the Valley. And this would be would become the 11th Corps, Army of the Potomac. The 3rd Corps, Army of Virginia, was Irvin McDowell's of Bull Run fame. He had divisions north of the Rappahannock at Waterloo Bridge and at Fredericksburg. And this would be the future 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac. The 2nd Corps, subject of this book and presentation, is later the 12th Corps, Army of the Potomac, is commanded by Nathaniel Prentice Banks. He was a political general. He had been Speaker of the House of Representatives and Governor of Massachusetts. Thanks to his political connections, he was one of the highest ranking major generals in the Army without getting any training. You'll see here in the image, Colonel John S. Clark. I'm not going to discuss him tonight, but he's an important figure and gets discussed a lot in the book. Pope was charged with pressuring Lee while McClellan was in front of him on the peninsula and maintaining contact with Fredericksburg. And that became particularly important after Cedar Mountain as reinforcements from the Army of the Potomac were trying to arrive. His intent was to be able to concentrate his 3 corps within 24 hours to strike either toward the rail hub at Gordonsville, which is right here, or against the Confederate flank if they attacked towards Fredericksburg. Robert E. Lee was then defending Richmond. Lee had a force detached at Hanover Junction, fronting the Federals at Fredericksburg because he was concerned with an advance from that direction. Lee was also concerned with the safety of Gordonsville because is an important hub of the Virginia Central Railroad and was a critical supply line for him. So Banks' Corps, 2nd Corps, began arriving at Little Washington, Virginia during the 3rd week of July. This is the first time most of the corps is together in one place. This great image is of a grand review that Banks held at Little Washington on July 28th. What you see is is what a member of the 2nd Massachusetts called sham battles, as Banks' cavalry escort, you see those right here, are charging against infantry squares, sort of a Napoleonic anachronism. And but he did some rather involved maneuvers, and then the event ended with these charges. And then during the 1st chapter of the book, I repeatedly returned to this event to introduce historical figures, and there's a lot of good detail on this event. So the 2nd Corps had 2 divisions. The 1st division was commanded by Brigadier General Alpheus Williams. He was a 1831 Yale graduate, had been a lawyer in Detroit, lieutenant colonel of a Michigan regiment in the Mexican War. He was steady, largely dependable. It passed over multiple times for Major General right up until the end of the war, despite the fact that he had led the Corps in several battles, including Antietam, during Gettysburg, a few others as well. His brigade commanders, first one is Samuel Wiley Crawford. He was from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, same county as me, actually. He's an 1846 Penn Medical School graduate. As an Army surgeon, and did a lot of tours out west before the war, including a legation to Mexico, where he was part of a geological expedition to a volcano, among other things. Kind of interesting. He was lucky to take a billet in 1860 at Fort Moultrie, and with the rest of that garrison transferred to Sumter, and he was a volunteer battery commander. So he got a lot of fame out of that. He then transferred to the infantry, no longer a surgeon, and was commissioned in the 13th Infantry and was on Rosecrans' staff in the fall of 61 in Western Virginia. Made brigadier general in spring of 62 and joined Banks as a supernumerary in time for Winchester, but he wasn't commanding troops there. And he supplanted the popular commander of that brigade, Colonel Dudley Donnelly of the 28th New York. The other brigade commander is George Henry Gordon from Massachusetts, who's a 46 grad of West Point, same as George McClellan, Stonewall Jackson, a few others. He was a dragoon under Bull Sumner, brevetted and wounded at 2 battles in the Mexican War, fought hand-to-hand with a couple guerrillas at San Juan Bridge. Then he did frontier duty for a little while before resigning in 1854 and attended Harvard Law and practiced in Boston. He was colonel of the 2nd Massachusetts, which was he turned into a highly professional regiment. And his brigade, especially 2nd Massachusetts, had a reputation for discipline. And he had personally difficult relations with Nathaniel Banks and also one of his regiments, 27th Indiana. It was Williams' division that had been routed at Winchester in May of 62. So unlike the 1st Division, the 2nd Division was just recently strung together. All of these officers, but Green on the far right, had served in Mexico. All but Geary were West Pointers. And we have the division commander is Christopher C. Auger. John White Geary commands the 1st Brigade. Those units, the Ohio regiments in that brigade, had been together for a while. It fought Jackson in the Valley, and then had also fought in Western Virginia. They're the only ones in the whole corps who had a victory, actually, up to this point. And so Geary had been a mayor of San Francisco and territorial governor of Kansas. Henry Prince was the 2nd Brigade commander. He had served in the Seminole and Utah Wars on either side of the Mexican War, during which he was severely wounded. And George Sears Green was 6 years Robert E. Lee's senior. So he's had some time under his belt. And he had instructed at West Point early on, mathematics and engineering, and garrisoned New England. That was the extent of his service. And then after that, he did civil engineering projects in New York State between 1836 and 1862. And I mentioned the Ohio regiments having some victories. Those would be in Western Virginia, Kernstown. They'd also been at Port Republic, which is, of course, not a victory. So as Banks' Corps was making its movement toward Little Washington, which is right here, 2 of Crawford's regiments under Colonel Donnelly headed to Culpeper Courthouse. Now, they were joining a cavalry detachment down there, Cavalry Brigade under John Hatch. Pope had directed that cavalry forward on the 14th of July to destroy railroad tracks at Gordonsville and east of Gordonsville, and then proceed to Charlottesville. Hatch took Donnelly's infantry with him on his cavalry raid, and he, not surprisingly, failed to meet his timeline. And what's worse, Jackson and Ewell's divisions, Confederate divisions, arrived in Gordonsville on the 15th. Pope was not best pleased with Hatch. He sent him on another mission, which he also failed to accomplish. And then he removed Hatch, who then moved to McDowell's Corps and commanded some infantry. And Pope elevated Major John Buford from kind of obscurity and to replace him in that brigade command. So that set Buford on track to have success at Gettysburg. And the balance of Crawford's brigade then arrived in Culpeper Courthouse on the 24th. A.P. Hill joined Jackson on July 30th, and that facilitated offensive operations, because up to that time, Jackson was more of a defensive posture, trying to keep Gordonsville safe. And Crawford operated somewhat anemically through the first week of August. He was spurred by Banks, who had been spurred by Pope. Banks wasn't giving sufficient reports from the front, and then he rolled that downhill to Crawford, who he actually Banks sent John Clark, that colonel that I mentioned before, to Culpeper to see what was going on, and he was feeding him information on how how Crawford was doing. Crawford became more active though, and that came to a head on August 2nd at Orange Courthouse. So early in the morning of August 2nd, Crawford had accompanied two cavalry regiments across Raccoon Ford on the Rapidan and approached Orange Courthouse from the east. And the two regiments were the 5th New York and the 1st Vermont Cavalry. As they approached Orange Courthouse, they brushed aside a company of the 17th Virginia Battalion, Cavalry Battalion. That was a half a mile east of town, right around here. And as they approached town, Crawford sent Captain John Hammond with 2 companies of the 5th New York left across the Gordonsville Road south of town. That's this movement. And then a detachment of the 1st Vermont swept right to approach town from the north, while the main column continued on Main Street. Meanwhile, Colonel William Grumble Jones with the 7th Virginia Cavalry arrived from Gordonsville. They're down here. And they discovered the 17th Virginia Battalion folks retreating. He then deployed a company of skirmishers, and then sent Major Thomas Marshall, a descendant of the first Chief Justice, off to the right to go past this rail depot and flank the Federals. Meanwhile, Jones continued north toward the square, as did the Federals. So, as the Federal column approached that intersection at the square, a New Yorker remembered a stillness like death had fallen over the town. Suddenly, Confederates, sabers drawn, turned the corner and charged the Federals. Most of them fell back. And then a squadron of the 1st Vermont in that main column had just been ordered to do the same, but the commander of its rear of 2 companies, Captain William Wells, pushed his men forward at the point of his saber. The squadron commander then belayed his previous order in order to charge. Meanwhile, the northern flanking column got into position and began firing on the Confederates. What that did was stalled the rear companies and isolated the vanguard, which continued forward into Wells's men. To the south, the 2 New York companies under Captain Hammond ran into the flank of Major Marshall's rebel flanking column. Marshall was captured and his force was scattered. Hammond then turned north into the main Confederate column, and there was a lot of sabers flying in the street by that intersection. Eventually, the Confederates are in there realized they had to withdraw, and a lot of them had to do so through alleyways. There's a haphazard pursuit followed, but most of the 7th Virginia made it back to this Willis property where they started without being too much molested. So after that, all that really happened was a little bit of railroad got dismantled, a few wires cut, some hen roosts were invaded, and Crawford, meanwhile, according to reports, was back. One person said a mile away. It's more likely he was on this hill a half a mile away, but had sent a message to everyone once the fighting was done to keep to their work. Soon, the 6th Virginia Cavalry showed up. The Federals could hear cheering from the 7th Virginia Cavalry as that happened, and they made a hasty retreat away with a few prisoners. So some intelligence was taken from the prisoners on that raid. Some of it was useful, but on the 6th, Pope began to concentrate towards Culpeper Courthouse. Banks and Ricketts moved first, followed by Sigel. On the march, General Gordon recalled clouds of dust hung over us. There was not a breath of air, and the road was like a furnace. The temperature during these days was in the 90s, and men died on the march. Jackson started toward Culpeper as his objective on the 7th, and made uncharacteristically slow progress. The causes were more varied than the heat, though. Miscommunication between Jackson and A.P. Hill, whose division was supposed to be second on the march following Ewell, was standing in Orange, watching Jackson's former division and his trains moved by. So he didn't get his spot in the line in March. And Ewell was north of the Rapidan and never appeared. So A.P. Hill never saw him, and he ended up following Jackson's division. Jackson and Hill were both incensed, and that carried over the next couple of days. Back in Culpeper, word that Jackson was across the Rapidan sent Crawford south on August 8th to meet George Bayard's cavalry, which had been doing a delaying action with Jackson's forces. And he met up with Bayard near Cedar Run. The balance of Banks' corps followed on August 9th, and despite his slow progress, Jackson's cavalry made an impression on Pope that Madison Courthouse was threatened. So Beverly Robertson's cavalry had initially been moving in the direction of Madison Courthouse. Really all he was doing was covering Ewell's left flank. But John Buford was over there and became convinced that Madison Courthouse was being threatened. And the result of that is, you see here, this is the road from Madison Courthouse. And Ricketts' division ends up being posted right there to cover the flank of the folks that are moving down towards Cedar Mountain. Prudent, given he was operating against Stonewall Jackson, but at some point Ricketts might have been accessed during this battle. Another unit that did not take part was the 28th Pennsylvania, and that was a 2nd Division unit in Geary's brigade. This is an oversized 15-company outfit. They were ordered to secure a signal detachment at Thoroughfare Mountain over here. So suddenly Geary's brigade was cut in half, and they really could have been used during this battle. Meanwhile, Crawford advanced beyond Cedar Run. The night before, he had taken position behind the run, and Beverly Robertson's cavalry, followed by Jubal Early's infantry, kept pushing towards Bayard's cavalry, his federal cavalry. We go over the field a little bit at Cedar Mountain. So here's the Orange Culpeper Road. It bisects it largely, of course, in east to west here. This is Cedar Run, and the north branch of Cedar Run goes up this way across the battlefield. There's a series of cornfields between Mitchell Station Road and the Crittenden Lane. And there's a gate here that's kind of well-known and important, through which a lot of Confederate forces are passing to get onto the field. And then north of the road, there's a wheat field. And north of that, there's a scrub field sort of at a 90-degree angle with it. A lot of people call it a brushy field as well. Basically, it's just had been in cultivation, but it's getting overgrown. George Henry Gordon's brigade arrives first on the field for the Federals. This was after, actually, go back a little bit, Jubal Early had arrived and taken position here after he brushed off George Bayard's cavalry, and the other 2 brigades in Ewell's division took position on the mountain with some batteries. Charles Winder arrived next, and he deployed Thomas Garnett's brigade in this sort of awkward right angle, which proved a real problem later on. And William Tullifer's brigade filled some of that interval between Garnett and Early. Charles Ronald's Stonewall brigade was held in reserve. So like I said, George Henry Gordon arrived first, and he noticed some high ground over here. And there's a little cottage, brown cottage, that's up on that high ground. And he suggested that would be a good place for the corps to anchor its right. Now, Pope had a staffer on hand to be his kind of eyes and ears, Brigadier General Benjamin Roberts. He agreed with what Gordon was saying, and so Gordon moved off to the right. No one ever told Banks, and Banks never really understood exactly where Gordon was, because he thought Gordon was here just off to the right of Crawford's brigade, whereas he was 3/4 of a mile away. Augur deployed south of the road, Geary first, closest to the road, and Henry Prince's brigade next to him, and then Green all the way down here. An artillery duel gets started at about 3 p.m., and that goes on for about 2 hours until the fighting starts. And that artillery duel results in Charles Winder, commanding the Jackson's former division, to be mortally wounded. Command passes to William Tullifer. Tullifer's relative, Alexander Galt Tullifer, takes over the brigade, and William Tullifer, now commanding the division, doesn't really know Jackson or Winder's plans, but he sends Ronald Stonewall Brigade and his own 10th Virginia to the left to try to get onto Garnett's left and provide some protection out that way. As that was going on, some regulars, 8th and 12th U.S. regular infantry from Prince's Brigade does skirmishing at the edge of the cornfield, covering the entire division front. The first main infantry to advance is Geary's brigade here. They move down and engage Tullifer, and then also the rightmost regiments in Garnett's brigade. Prince then advances his first line, and he moves them down here, the edge of the cornfield. He'll end up going back for the others in a minute. A.P. Hill then also begins arriving. So he had been strung out on the road because of the marching problems he had before. And Jackson sends his lead brigade under Brigadier General Edward Thomas, a bunch of Georgians, to the right ultimately, and Early moves them off to secure his right. And he moves downhill to put them into place near it's known as Cedars. It's a cluster of trees and a few batteries there at the Cedars. One regiment, the 14th Georgia, is left behind to bolster Tullifer's line. So while all this is going on, there's a bit of conversation amongst Crawford and his officers in the woods. They had moved forward into the woods nearly to the edge of the wheat field, and they're deciding whether or not they should go forward and try to capture the batteries here by the gate. Knipe, the commander of the 46th Pennsylvania, thought it'd be a very good idea to go, and an easy thing. Crawford was supporting as well. Others were objecting, thinking they didn't know exactly what was out there. Crawford sent back to Banks and eventually got orders to go. He had also requested battery support that never came in time, and the men in the brigade could see this little conference of the brigade officers going on, and they could sense that they were about to go attack by the excited nature of the conversation. So the Federals were formed up. They came out of the woods and got aligned, gave a loud hurrah and headed forward. The Confederates see this. They a little bit nervous too, because the right of the Union line was overlapping the left of the Confederate line by a little bit. So they went forward. The 5th Connecticut got into a little bit of trouble, and they got held up kind of near this rivulet. They were stuck there for a time, exchanging fire with the Virginians in front of them. 28th New York was facing the 1st Virginia Battalion. The 1st Virginia Battalion got 3 volleys off. Most of them were too high. The last one landed, but it wasn't sufficient to stop the New Yorkers. They pushed on through into the 1st Virginia Battalion, which then ran. And then the New Yorkers wheeled around and actually got behind the Confederates some of them were paying attention to the cornfield. Some of them were paying attention to 5th Connecticut. And it was quite a surprise for some of them, 21st Virginia in particular. So they got a volley in their backs. But there was a lot of kind of vicious hand-to-hand fighting in the woods. Very smoke-filled, a lot of confusion, and people were breaking into little squads and such. And that was the nature of the fighting there. Meanwhile, Crawford was still in the woods on the other side of the wheat field. According to several accounts, he gave the order to go and then stayed behind the woods. So Dudley Donnelly, who you see here, was the de facto brigade commander. He'd be mortally wounded in this action. So one interesting thing is that the 3rd Wisconsin from Gordon's brigade had been sent out into this region, basically do reconnaissance. As Crawford's brigade advanced toward the wheat field, they crossed paths with them. Ultimately, this detachment, it was only 6 companies, got orders to join Crawford, despite protests from its colonel, Thomas Ruger, who's a pretty solid commander. So what Ruger did, he had a short conversation with his folks, bit of a pep talk, and then he moved right to sort of uncover, because the 46th Pennsylvania had gone through his lines as they went forward. And as it turns out, he went a little bit too far right. And when he came out, they were on this scrub field and not in the wheat field. Now, the traditional explanation of all this is that 3rd Wisconsin was actually fighting in the wheat field, and Ronald's brigade, which eventually found where it was supposed to be and got orders to go forward, advanced and then wheeled to the right and then fired from the scrub field into the 3rd Wisconsin. But the research that I've done indicates that the 3rd Wisconsin was actually up here. The Stonewall Brigade units actually engaged Federals in the scrub field, and it was only about 2 or 3 minutes before they were driven off, because there were 6 companies facing 3 regiments. The Stonewall Brigade didn't go very well for them. They had high casualties. But the 3rd Wisconsin then fell back into the woods to this ravine. 2.5 of the companies were there. Others went elsewhere. Colonel Ruger eventually brought others back to them before the whole brigade came up. Now, after this happened, the Stonewall Brigade did wheel to the right, got onto this ridge, which is in several counts as they border between the wheat field and the scrub field, and fired on what was left of units coming across the wheat field. 46th Pennsylvania had trailed the other 2 units by a little bit, and it's most likely they were receiving that fire. But once the 46th Pennsylvania got across into the woods, they ran into the 10th Virginia, which hadn't gotten into place just yet, and it drove them off. And then a portion of the 46th Pennsylvania wheeled to the right into the 27th Virginia, the Stonewall Brigade, and drove them off too. This drawing that I showed, I'm showing here, is actually from Thomas Ruger's report in the National Archives. It's not in the OR, the published OR, but it is in the National Archives, and it shows a slight ridge here, which had been described by other accounts, and it shows pretty much the correct orientation of the Stonewall Brigade. If you look at their official reports, and the 3rd Wisconsin, you'll see on the other side of this ridge is the 46th Pennsylvania. So that's a fairly strong indication that this is the scrub field and this is the wheat field down here. There's a lot of conjecture about exactly where the boundaries of these 2 fields are, but here's a ridge that I see as the boundary between those 2 fields. Geary's folks have been engaged for a little while down here in the cornfield. His 7th Ohio draws off under heavy fire because he's getting it from 2 directions. The 29th and 5th Ohio then deploy on either side of the 66th Ohio. Prince, like I mentioned before, leaves his first line, the 111th Pennsylvania and 3rd Maryland, and goes all the way back to the other side of the Mitchell Station Road to collect his second line and guide them forward. So he returns to where the first line is, gives very particular instructions to the 109th Pennsylvania, 102nd New York, that his own troops are out there, that they need to fire obliquely. He actually deployed them in echelon. And despite that, it does seem the 109th Pennsylvania fired at least close enough to 3rd Maryland to make them not very happy. And they left soon after that. And the 111th Pennsylvania followed them off the field. Now, Colonel John Patrick of the 5th Ohio is over here. He wrote that the regiment to his left, which is presumably the 111th Pennsylvania, withdrew after one volley. But and he was complaining about that. They had done so after being engaged long enough for Prince to return all the way back to the other side of Mitchell Station Road, which is quite a distance, collect his second line and bring him forward. And the 111th Pennsylvania accumulated 90 casualties during that time. So it's not like they just shirked their duties. This withdrawal, however, left the 109th Pennsylvania and the 102nd New York alone on Prince's line. A private in the 102nd New York described the scene as a seething, burning, hell-ridden cornfield where the screech of shells, the ping of the bullets, and shouts of the men, together with the fearful havoc in our ranks, made it possible to imagine oneself in a veritable hell with the concomitant devil and all his imps. And it was a bad place, and it was certainly hot that day too. And men in Thomas's brigade, these Georgians, were getting up into the cedars and around them, and they were picking off the officers in the 102nd New York down the line from the left to the right. So about this time, a gunner in one of these cedar batteries, a Dements, Maryland Confederate battery, remembered a rumbled roar and crackling like the noise of a mighty windstorm smashing and breaking through the woods. And what he was hearing was Crawford's brigade coming out of the woods and across the road. And this movement caused all of Tullifer's brigade and half of Early's brigade to leave. The officer rode up and told all these batteries to limber to the rear as well. And so the only batteries left here was this one out in front. Back in the woods, Jackson, who had been positioned in this region, had heard all this going on, and he had moved toward the action and ultimately into the woods after telling these batteries to limber to the rear. He got into the woods back to where Garnett's people had fallen back to, and did the famous episode that a lot of people know of him, raising his rusted sword in the scabbard and encouraging folks to reform. What really saved the day, though, was the rest of A.P. Hill's division arriving, because Garnett's people didn't really. They would join other units in small groups, but it wasn't a wholesale resurgence from them. Crawford's brigade, they're by now very disorganized, with units mixed, and they're losing effectiveness. Their offensive strength is kind of gone. And then they begin taking fire on the flank from the 14th Georgia that had been positioned back here, from the 13th Virginia and 31st Virginia, which had fallen back but sort of kept their order, and also from A.P. Hill's folks that are showing up. Branch's North Carolina Brigade is the first one. Crawford's people now need to run a gauntlet to and across the wheat field to reach safety. So some instances of prisoners being dispatched, Confederate prisoners, on this retreat. And Banks starts calling on reinforcements. The first is Gordon's brigade. Gordon was in front of the Brown cottage way back here. He'd been on his horse looking through his binoculars for a signal from Williams. He was posted down here, signal to go forward. And he never saw that signal, but a staffer eventually showed up and told him to go. His people double quicked down that hillside and back up the steep slope on the other side, and it was quite an elevation over brambles and rocks and such. And they eventually they scoop up these Third Wisconsin companies, and they all end up here at the edge of the wheat field. It takes them some time to do that, though, because they were 3/4 of a mile away. Meanwhile, Crawford's people are falling back through the wheat field. The 10th Maine also advances. They arrive first. They're much closer, and they'd been guarding a battery. That battery was getting the worst of the counter battery fire, and the men were, blanching next to it. They started sidling to the right to kind of get away from it. And eventually, the battery moved away, and now they're left as sort of a de facto bodyguard from Nathaniel Banks. So Banks sends them forward eventually. They reach the cornfield, or excuse me, the wheat field, just as Branch's North Carolinians do, and they move into the wheat field, and their colonel, Beale, he determines that, okay, they're a little bit too far ahead. Part of that's because you have Crawford's people streaming past saying, you can't stay here. There are too many of them. You got to get back. And so Beale thinks, okay, well, I'm going to get back to the wood line for some protection. One of Banks' staffers, Major Louis Pelouse, he sees this. He goes out and he tells Beale that he's not authorized to withdraw, and wants to know what he's doing. They have a disagreement right out there in the field under fire from these North Carolinians. Gesticulations of the two men resemble a fist fight to the infantry with him. Pelouse offers to lead the 10th Maine, and Beale rejects that kind offer, and he ends up moving his people back to the ridge line in the wheat field, which is right about here, and they do their fighting from there. Meanwhile, James Archer's brigade, they sidle up next to Branch, and their accounts of them picking off individual Mainers that are heading toward the rear. And so now you have three Confederate brigades, including the Stonewall Brigade up here, taking shots at the 10th Maine. They start to move off right about the time that Gordon reaches the edge of the wheat field 300 yards to the north of him. Meanwhile, some of the Confederate stalwarts, 14th Georgia, 13th Virginia, they go forward again. They do a final drive away of the Ohioans, and then they end up wheeling to the left. So the last of the three sort of flailing hooks that Banks sends at the situation, squadron of cavalry from the 1st Pennsylvania. He sends them forward. They charge down the Orange Road and get into the wheat field and charge towards Branch's people. But by the time that they get there, 14th Georgia, 13th Virginia are lining the fence on that road, and they're firing into the flanks of these cavalry while they're getting it from the front from Branch's people, and they end up breaking and heading back to where they came from. Gordon's now at the wheat field. They stall Archer's people for a little while. Archer actually he heads across the wheat field. His right gets stalled, and they're out across that field at sort of an angle. The 2nd Massachusetts is laying heavy fire onto them, and that continues on here for a little while. Gordon's brigade by this time is alone on this edge or on this portion of the field north of the road. William Pender's brigade of North Carolinians show up, and they had gotten led across the north edge of the scrub field by one of Ronald's staffers, and puts them right on the flank of Gordon's people. And he just rolls up Gordon's flank. And they all end up heading back toward the Brown Cottage. Archer and Pender sort of get intermingled a little bit because Archer springs forward again too. And the two of them decide to just sort of command the whole two brigades jointly. Branch swings into the cornfield, and pretty much everybody else is swinging in the cornfield too. By this time, the two brigades from the mountain had come off, and they are pushing Greene off and nearly capture the 102nd. A lot of people from the 102nd New York, who are really the last ones to leave. During this time, Henry Prince gets captured in the cornfield, and by this time, both Augur and Geary had been wounded. So the 2nd Division, a lot of casualties at the command level. Here are the casualties in general. I'll let you have a look at those. They're pretty high, especially in Crawford's brigade. Banks also became a casualty. That evening, he had been hit by a horse when some 7th Virginia cavalry ambushed him and Pope and their staffs. Federal casualties were then left on the field for 2 days behind Confederate lines. They were facing the same intense heat that they had been. Some mixed behavior by the Confederates, some efforts to create shade or bring water to the Federals. There's also a good many reports of looting, both of wounded and the dead. After Cedar Mountain, Jackson slips across the Rapidan. Lee joins him the 3rd week of August, and that initiates the campaign that culminates in 2nd Manassas. For Banks' Corps, Pope keeps them out of that campaign as much as he can. Nevertheless, they have a miserable, sort of debilitating period from August 20th to September 3rd. But things turn around really fast once they enter Maryland, and the Corps achieves great success at Antietam. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take anyone's questions. And you can, of course, buy my book at savasbeatty.com or reach out to me. I have copies as well.